Happy 2024. I hope you are off to a great new year. This week, we are making healthy meals in 2024 with homemade bagels, instant smoothies, a no-noodle lasagna, and a little spin on a vegetable soup. Not only are these freezer-friendly and make-ahead-friendly meals and recipes, but they are also healthier versions of some of our favorite foods that tend to not be quite so healthy. So I'm kicking things off today with homemade bagels, and this is one of my tried and true recipes. Look, I know that everyone says to cut out carbs to meet your nutrition goals. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to stop eating carbs. So what I like to do is replace some of the ingredients to make it a little bit more nutritious and more filling. And I do that here by adding in Greek yogurt to a simple no yeast bagel recipe. This recipe calls for 1 cup of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 3/4 teaspoons of kosher salt, 1 cup of Greek yogurt. I use non-fat because that's what I had on hand, and then 1 egg for an egg wash at the end. Anytime that I am trying to make something that has maybe nutritious ingredients or a little more healthful, I like to make extra so that way it's easy to have on hand. Now, I'm not saying that a bagel made with Greek yogurt is going to change your nutritional goals or your life, but it is a healthier version. I'd much rather have these on hand regularly. So what I did is I made 3 batches of this. So I ended up with about 18 bagels in the end and put them in the freezer. To make this, all you do is you mix all the ingredients together. The dough is a little bit shaggy, but once you get it mixed together, put it out onto a floured surface and then knead the dough for about 2 to 3 minutes, adding flour as necessary. But do keep in mind that this should be a relatively sticky dough. So as you can see, the dough isn't really sticking to my hands, but it is a little stickier than a traditional dough. Then you just divide it into as many portions as you want. I made some smaller ones for my toddler and then some larger ones for things like maybe a bagel sandwich down the road. Just roll it out until it's about 3/4 inches in circumference and then shape it into a bagel shape. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you're making these, they do rise and puff in the oven because they have leavener in it. So you'll want to make the bagel look a little rounder, a larger hole in the middle than what you would necessarily think. Then just take 1 egg white, beat it with a fork for a second, use a silicone brush, and then top your bagels with a little bit of that egg white. Then after this, you can season them however you want. I love everything bagel seasoning. It's the best. So I just sprinkle some everything bagel seasoning on top and then bake these in the oven at 375 for about 20 to 22 minutes. Keep an eye on them. I did find that the last batch I had in the oven for closer to 25 minutes and they got a little dark. So 20 to 22 should be just right. These are delicious and they are great for the freezer. And hey, maybe your kid will think they're donuts like mine did.
I'm gonna eat them all.
You're gonna eat them all?
It's just so, and these are donuts.
They're donuts?
Yes.
These are, in fact, not donuts, but they are delicious. As you can see here, the bread is light and fluffy. This is a versatile recipe. You can just eat a plain bagel. You can have it with whipped cream cheese. You can make a little bagel sandwich. Also, this dough is really great for things like pizza crust, calzones, and more. So it's versatile, delicious, and freezer friendly. To freeze these, just make sure they come all the way down to room temperature. Label a freezer bag, throw them in there, and stick them right in the freezer. And that way you have a bagel with a little punch of protein whenever you want one. Anytime that I am in the mood to eat healthier, and in this case, try to eat healthier all year, one thing that I have to do is make sure that it's so easy I have no excuse not to. And that's where instant smoothies come into play. Now, fair warning, you will either need to have freeze-dried fruit, a freeze dryer, or adapt this recipe to just make individual fruit smoothie bags. But what I'm doing here is I got some frozen fruit from Costco, putting it into my freeze dryer. If you want to learn more about the Harvest Right freeze dryer like you see here, I'll drop a link about it in the description box below. And I'll also add a few links for some freeze-dried fruit that I like if you don't have a freeze dryer. But all I'm doing here is I'm putting pre-frozen fruit into my freeze dryer and I'm hitting go. And like magic, it's 48 hours later. It took 2 days for these to freeze dry, but then once they're completely dry, I am simply just blending them in my NutriBullet into a powder. And then I am just putting that powder into a jar. So I have strawberry powder, cherry powder, and pineapple powder. To use this for an instant smoothie, then all I do is just put a few tablespoons of the fruit powder into some milk kefir. Now, I plan on putting out a video about how to make milk kefir later in 2024, so stay tuned for that. But if you don't have milk kefir, that's fine. You can use almond milk, whole milk, whatever you have on hand will work, and however you like to make smoothies. So this is really nice because I don't have to bust out my blender every single time I want a smoothie. And then my family, none of us can ever agree on what type of smoothie we want for the day. So I don't have to get a bunch of different fruits out and use the blender 3 different times. Simply, I can just mix and match whatever flavors everybody wants, and we have a healthy, nutritious smoothie to have for breakfast. My personal favorite is cinnamon and cherry. That's what I had. My daughter had strawberry. My husband had a mix of all 3. Now, if you don't have freeze-dried fruit or freeze dryer, you can simply put pre-portioned frozen fruit into bags and then just make smoothies with those individual portions as you want them. I've mentioned before, I think on my last freezer meal video, which I'll link in the description box below, that one thing I don't like about freezer meals is they often tend to be really heavy in pasta and cheese. And don't get me wrong, your girl likes pasta and cheese. That's like part of the problem over here. I can eat pasta and cheese every day. So this is an adaptation of a lasagna that uses butternut squash instead of noodles. And just a spoiler alert, this was so good. My husband and I both agreed we didn't even miss the noodles at all. I don't have this recipe on my site yet, and a new moon of magnolia.com is launching in early 2024. So if you want the recipe, it is in the description box below. But in short, this was ground beef, which you could use chicken sausage, ground turkey, you could use whatever meat you want in here, onion, garlic, home canned tomatoes, butternut squash, cottage cheese, because I don't really like ricotta cheese that much, and also cottage cheese is a little bit healthier, Parmesan cheese, parsley, 1 egg, and also some fresh mozzarella. I actually didn't have any homemade mozzarella on hand this time, so this was store-bought, but it was still very good. I recently shared a lasagna recipe on a video that I'll link in the description box below, but where this differs is that the noodles are instead butternut squash. I am proud to say that these are baby butternut squash that I grew in my own garden in 2023, and I'm using them now. I will be sharing more about gardening and in particular growing your own food, especially if you live in the suburbs later in 2024. But for now, I'm using up what I have and waiting for garden season to start. To make this lasagna, it's as easy as any lasagna. You make the sauce, and in this case, you then peel and chop up the butternut squash, mix together the cottage cheese, Parmesan cheese, egg, and parsley, and then you begin layering. For this, I actually like to use a square baking dish. I know a lot of lasagna recipes call for like a 9x13 rectangular, but I like my lasagna a little bit thicker, and I didn't really have enough butternut squash to spread out over a long rectangular pan, and this worked out great because I was able to get a nice thick lasagna. I also want to note here that you can use any vegetable you want instead of butternut squash. This would be excellent with zucchini. You could even use eggplant or whatever you have on hand. I just chopped this up and made it more like a casserole because my butternut squash, they were little babies, so they were kind of small. You could even chop them in rounds and make them a little bit wider to take up more space in your pan if that's what you prefer. But you can see I'm just layering on top. So I have sauce, cheese, butternut squash, and then sauce, cheese, butternut squash, and then I end with sauce and a little bit more mozzarella. Covered this with aluminum foil, and I baked it for about 30 minutes at 375. And then I took the foil off and baked it for about another 5 to 7 minutes just to get that cheese nice and melty, and this was so good. The one caveat that I would note here is that because you don't have noodles absorbing the moisture, this did get a little watery in the bottom. So if you plan on freezing this, let it come to room temperature, and then what I would do is I would take the lasagna out and put it into another dish, making sure that that liquid in the bottom doesn't go with it into the new dish. Now, for sure, you can make this healthier by using less cheese. I prefer to use homemade mozzarella, but like I said, I didn't have any on hand, so I added a little bit more of the store-bought because it just doesn't melt the same way that homemade does, and it doesn't have quite the flavor, but it was still really delicious. And last up for healthy meals in 2024, and I feel like I should note before we get into this vegetable soup that I've worn 1,000 different outfits in this video, and that is because I don't want to fool you into thinking that I'm doing this all in one day. This is over the course of a few days because that is the most realistic way to be able to keep cooking healthy and to make freezer meals and bulk prepare our food. Some people can do it all in one day. I can't. I have small windows of time, so just as a reminder, you can do this over the course of a few days and it will be totally fine. So this is a healthy vegetable soup. And look, I think most vegetable soups are pretty healthy, but what I like about this one is it uses some superfoods and it also just changes up the flavors of a vegetable soup a little bit. This is a combination of onion, carrots, sweet potato, fire roasted diced tomatoes, garlic, oregano, chicken broth, bay leaves, cherry tomatoes, green beans, a little bit of red wine vinegar, and chopped kale. And I'm just taking some pictures of the ingredients along the way. You've probably seen this in this video because I am prepping my new blog with these recipes. Making this soup is as easy as making any vegetable soup. So essentially, I just heat up a little bit of olive oil in my Dutch oven, and then I first saute the hard vegetables. So I start with the onion and carrots and saute them for a few minutes, and then I added in this sweet potato and cook that for like 3 or 4 more minutes. Then I add in the canned tomatoes. Those fire roasted red tomatoes are really what makes this really delicious. So be sure to add that in there. And then I add in the garlic. One note about garlic is I like to add this in with more liquidy things and before I bring things to a boil rather than at the beginning, because if garlic gets overcooked, it is bitter and gross. So I'd rather put it in toward the middle of the recipe than the beginning. Next, I'm adding in chicken broth. I use 8 cups of Costco chicken broth. I prefer homemade bone broth, but I actually don't have any at the moment, so that worked just fine. And then the bay leaves and oregano. I'm bringing that to a boil, and when the sweet potatoes are close to being done, then I'm adding in the kale and the green beans and cherry tomatoes. I let this simmer until the green beans and the kale were cooked, but if you ask me, you can hardly overcook a green bean or kale. Maybe you disagree, but I think green beans and kale are good when they are like fully cooked. So once they were fully cooked, I added in a little bit of red wine vinegar to add some depth of the flavor, and this was delicious. This is totally freezer friendly. I actually did not freeze this one because I ran out of freezer bags. But if you were to freeze this, I actually have a video where I'm freezing bone broth. You can check that link in the description box below and you can see how I do it. But honestly, all you do is just make sure you double bag it and then lay it flat to freeze. So that way it's not like a big chunk. It's a little easier for you to thaw and use right away. Honestly, I'm not much of a New Year's resolution person. That doesn't really work well for me. But what I do like about preparing healthy meals ahead of time, especially if you have health goals, is that you don't have to use it right away. So come February, March, April, when maybe some of us have forgotten our New Year's resolutions or our health goals, you open up the freezer and boom, there it is. You have healthy food that you didn't have to think about, that you prepared in advance. And that to me is a great way to start setting yourself up for success if making healthy family meals that are maybe even freezer friendly is your goal for 2024. Now, if you made it this far in this video, you probably noticed that there were a few shots of me climbing up on a little stool taking pictures. Here are some sneak peeks of photos that will be on my new blog soon. Thank you so much for tuning into Moon and Magnolia, where we elevate the everyday from scratch and at home, and I'll see you again next time.